The roof had been leaking since October, and she had been managing it the way she managed everything she could not immediately fix, which was with a bucket and a systematic approach to moving things out of the path of the drip, and a mental note that the repair was next on the list after the fence line on the south pasture, and the water pump on the east well, and the three other items that had been next on the list since her husband had died in August. Her name was Faye Alcott, and she was 37, and she had been managing the Alcott spread on the West Dunmore Range alone since August, which was 5 months. And the 5 months had been the most concentrated education in what a working operation required that she had ever received. Because she had been working the operation alongside her husband for 11 years and had understood her half of it completely and his half of it in the way that you understood the half you were not responsible for, which was adequately, and without the granular knowledge that came from being the one who did it. And now she was doing both halves and acquiring the granular knowledge at the speed that necessity imposed. The granular knowledge had costs she had not anticipated. The herd management she had understood in principle and was managing in practice, though the practice was slower and more physically demanding than it had been when there were two of them. The accounts she had understood completely because the accounts had been her domain, and the accounts were current. The supply management had been shared, and she was managing it alone at the adequate level, which was the level that kept the operation running without waste and without the surplus that came from being able to plan farther ahead than the next immediate need. The infrastructure, the roof, the pump, the fences, the barn, the well housing, the irrigation gates. This had been entirely his, and she was learning it from first principles, in the specific way that you learn things when there was no one else to do them. She had been managing. The cattle were sound, the accounts were current, the supply was adequate, the fence line on the south pasture was holding for now, which was not the same as repaired, but was the same as not urgent. The water pump on the east well was intermittent in a way she had learned to work around. The roof was leaking into a bucket in the northwest corner of the kitchen, and she had been meaning to get to it, and she had not gotten to it. And then she had woken up on a Thursday morning in January, and the bucket was empty and the ceiling above it was dry. She stood in the kitchen, and she looked at the dry ceiling for a long time. She went outside in the January morning, and she looked at the roof with the attention of a person reading something rather than looking at something, which was the attention her father had given her for reading work done by others. The northwest section, which had been the problem section since October, had new shingles. The new shingles were a slightly different color from the old shingles because they were new and they were laid in the specific overlapping pattern that produced a weatherproof seal, with the exposure correct and the fastening pattern correct and the ridge cap reset where the old one had lifted. And the work was competent in the specific way that meant it had been done by someone who had done this kind of roof before and knew where a northwest corner was likely to fail and had addressed the failure point, rather than only the visible damage. She looked at the ridge cap that had been reset. She looked at the new flashing around the chimney, which had not been on the list because she had not identified it as a problem, but which had been addressed because whoever had done the roof had known that a northwest corner failure usually meant the chimney flashing was part of the problem, and had been right, and had fixed it without being asked to. She went back inside. She looked at the pantry. The pantry was full. The pantry had been at approximately half supply, which was the level she had been managing it at since August, because half supply was adequate for one person, and she had not had occasion to restock to the full level that the pantry had been kept at when there were two of them. Full supply was a different organizational condition from half supply. It required a different arrangement of the shelves, a different rotation system, a different understanding of what would be used and in what order, and she looked at the full pantry and she saw that it was organized correctly for a full supply. Not incorrectly stocked on top of a half supply arrangement, but genuinely reorganized for the fuller condition, with the dry goods at the back, in the correct quantities and the perishables at the front and the quantities she would have ordered herself, and the supply contracts he used rather than the generic equivalents. She stood in the pantry for a long time. She checked the supply ledger. There was no entry for a January delivery. She checked the back of the ledger where she kept the delivery records. No delivery. She checked the kitchen door and the supply room door for any kind of note or receipt. Nothing. The pantry had been restocked by someone who knew her pantry system and her supply preferences and had not left a record of the restocking because the record was not the point. The point was the pantry. She stood in the pantry and she thought about who in the West Dunmore range knew her supply preferences and her pantry system. The answer was one person, which was the man who had been her neighbor for 14 years, and who had eaten at her table 6 times in those 14 years, and who had been in the kitchen in November, when she had been organizing the supply for winter. She decided not to mention the pantry. The second thing happened in February. She had been managing the water pump on the east well with the workaround she had developed in September, which was to prime it twice before drawing rather than once. And the double priming added 4 minutes to the morning water routine and was not ideal but was functional. She had known since October what the underlying problem was, a valve seat that had worn and was not seating correctly on the first prime. And she had ordered the replacement parts in December, and the parts had arrived in January, and she had been waiting for a clear morning with enough light to do the repair correctly, because the valve seat replacement required working inside the pump housing. And she had not done this repair before, and she was not going to attempt it. In poor light. She woke up on a Wednesday morning in February, and she went to the east well, and the pump drew on the first prime. She stood at the well for a moment, and she primed it again to confirm, and it drew correctly. And she primed it a third time to be certain, and it drew correctly each time. And she stood at the well in the February morning, and she looked at the pump housing, and she thought about the replacement parts on the shelf in the supply room that she had ordered, that were still on the shelf because whoever had done the repair had not used her parts, they had brought their own. She went to the supply room. Her parts were where she had left them. She went back to the east well, and she read the repair the way her father had taught her to read repairs, not looking at the surface, but looking at the choices that the repair required, the sequence of decisions that produced the outcome, and what those decisions told you about the person who made them. The east well pump repair showed a specific understanding of the pump mechanism it came from having done it before on the same model, which meant whoever had repaired it had this model of pump, and had repaired it themselves, and had known without looking where the fault would be, and had brought their own parts, because they had the right parts on hand. She knew one person in the West Dunmore range who had this model of pump and had been running it for 14 years. She went back inside, and she did not mention the pump. She waited for the third thing. She did not have to wait long. The south fence had been the most visible item on her list, because it was the most visible problem on the range, and she had been watching it deteriorate through February with the specific patience of a person who had ranked her tasks correctly, which was to say, she had ranked the cattle and the accounts and the supply above the fence because the fence was holding and the other things were immediate, and the monitoring had been her concession to the fence's existence. His name was Ward Aldrin, and he ran cattle on the north section of the range, and he had been a neighbor of the Alcott spread for 14 years, which was 3 years longer than she had been there. And he was 45, and he had been widowed for 6 years, and he had been managing his operation alone for 6 years. And he was the only person she could think of who knew the layout of her pantry well enough to restock it correctly, and who had the competence to repair a roof to that standard, and who would have done both of these things without being asked, and without mentioning it. She knew him the way you knew a good neighbor on a working range, which was through the accumulation of small, reliable facts over years rather than through close knowledge. She knew that he ran his herd correctly, and that his fence lines were maintained to a standard that made shared boundary management easy. She knew that he was direct in the way that made boundary conversations straightforward rather than delicate. She knew that he had helped her husband twice with infrastructure problems in 11 years, and both times had come without being asked and had done the work and gone home, and her husband had mentioned it in the particular tone he used for people he considered reliable. She knew that in the 6 weeks after August he had not come to the door with the specific quality of presence that required her to be sad for him, which was the quality she found most exhausting in the people who came to offer condolence, and which he had been entirely without, when he had come in September with the dish from his kitchen and the 40 minutes of conversation about the range. She considered all of this for a moment. She decided not to mention the roof or the pantry. This is dusty vows, where the quietest gestures carry the most weight. A man who repaired a roof and filled a pantry and said nothing. A woman who noticed and said nothing back. The silence between two people who have decided the same thing without discussing it. If you want the next story the moment it lands, subscribe now, then back to the range. The second thing happened in February. She had been managing the water pump on the east well with the workaround she had developed, which was to prime it twice before drawing rather than once, and the double priming added 4 minutes to the morning water routine and was not ideal, but was functional, and she had been planning to address the underlying problem when she had a clear day and the right parts. She had ordered the parts in December, and the parts had arrived in January, and the parts were on the shelf in the supply room waiting for the clear day. She woke up on a Wednesday morning in February, and she went to the east well, and the pump drew on the first prime. She stood at the well for a moment. She primed it again to confirm. It drew correctly. She primed it a third time. It drew correctly each time she went to the supply room. The parts she had ordered were still on the shelf because the pump had not been repaired with her parts. Whoever had done the repair had brought their own. She went back to the east well, and she looked at it with the attention of a person who is reading a repair rather than performing it, which was the attention her father had taught her, which was that a repair told you something about the person who had made it. The east well pump repair was internally consistent and showed a specific understanding of the pump mechanism that came from experience rather than from reading a manual, which was to say whoever had done it had done this kind of repair before and had done it on a pump of this exact model and had known without the manual where the fault was likely to be. She knew one person in the West Dunmore range who had a pump of this exact model and who had been running it for 14 years. She went back inside. She did not mention the pump. The third thing happened in March. She had been watching the fence line on the south pasture deteriorate through February with the specific patience of a person who had too many things to address and had ranked them correctly, which was to say the fence was holding and the other things were more urgent and the fence was being monitored. The south fence had 14 posts that needed resetting and 2 sections of wire that needed replacing, and she had been planning to spend a week on it in March, when the ground thawed enough to set posts correctly. She woke up on a Monday morning in March, and the south fence was done. Not partly done, not addressed in a few places, done. All 14 posts reset and plumbed correctly, and the 2 wire sections replaced with wire of the correct gauge, and the whole line walked and checked, which she could tell because the work was not the work of someone who had done the obvious parts and left. It was the work of someone who had walked the entire line before starting and had addressed everything the line required, including 2 additional spots she had not yet identified as problems, which meant whoever had done it had read the fence more thoroughly than she had read it herself. The walking before starting and the finding of the additional spots told her the same thing the roof and the pump and the pantry had told her, which was that the person who was doing these things was doing them the way she would have done them if she had his knowledge and his experience, which was completely and without the performance of completion. She stood at the south fence in the March morning, and she looked at the plumb posts and the new wire and the 2 spots she had not identified, and she thought about them for a long time. She thought about the roof in January and the pump in February and the pantry in January and the cattle drive in November, and she thought about Ward Aldrin on the north section who had been her neighbor for 14 years and who had never in 14 years done any of these things because her husband had been alive and the things had not needed doing. She thought about the last 7 months and what they told her about the person who had been watching them from the north section. In September, a month after her husband had died, Ward Aldrin had come to the door and had brought a dish from his kitchen, and had said he was sorry, and had stayed for 40 minutes and had talked about the range and the fall grazing, and had not said anything that required her to perform grief for him, which had been a specific relief, because the people who required her to perform grief for them were the people she found hardest to be with in the months after August, and he had not been one of them. He had come 3 more times in the fall, each time with something practical, a tool she needed, information about the county water schedule, a spare part for the barn latch, and each time with the quality of a man who was present without requiring anything from the presence. And she had received the visits as something that was happening in the period when everything was simply happening, and she was in the middle of it. In November, he had helped her move the cattle to the winter pasture. She had been planning to attempt it alone, which would have required 3 days at minimum, and would have been physically at the edge of what one person could do with the Alcott herd. He had arrived on the morning she had decided to attempt it, and had not explained how he knew the day, and she had not asked, and they had moved the cattle together in 1 day. And the doing of it in 1 day rather than 3 was this specific kind of efficiency that changed the character of a task from ordeal to work. And he had gone home after without mentioning the next time, the roof in January, the pantry in January, the pump in February, the south fence in March, with 2 additional spots she had not found herself. She stood at the south fence, and she counted the gestures, and she thought about what they added up to. She was a person who added things up carefully, and did not mistake the sum for something other than what it was. And what this sum was a person who was doing things for her in the specific language of a person who understood that doing was more precise than saying. She did not go to tell him what she had counted. She went back inside, and she thought about what the counting required from her, and what it required was a gesture in kind, done in the same language. She thought about what she knew about his operation that he had not yet addressed. She had been looking at the north section from her side of the boundary for 11 years, and had registered what she saw there with the passive accumulation of a person who paid attention to her surroundings as a matter of practice. And the accumulation had produced 3 things she knew about the north section that she had the capacity to address. Tell me, when she stood at the south fence and counted the gestures, did you understand that she was not counting debts? She was counting evidence? A person who does things correctly and quietly is telling you something. She was deciding what the something was. Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. Now back to the range. She addressed the first thing in April. The first thing was the county assessment discrepancy on the north section, which she knew about because Ward Aldrin had mentioned in November when they were moving the cattle that the county had flagged a discrepancy in his spring assessment filing, and he had not been able to find the source of it. And he had said it in the tone of a person mentioning a problem that was on the list rather than asking for help with it. She had noted it the way she noted things that were not immediately actionable, which was specifically and without acting on it before she understood what acting on it would require. What acting on it required was a reading of the county assessment format and a cross-reference against the supply ledger categories, and she knew both because she had done exactly this work for the Alcott spread 4 years ago. The Alcott discrepancy had come from an entry in the supply ledger that had been categorized in the wrong column, a routine misclassification that the county's format made easy to make and that the county's auditing process was designed to catch after the fact rather than before. She had found it in an afternoon the first time, which meant she could find it in a shorter afternoon if she knew what she was looking for. She wrote to the county assessor's office and requested the relevant documents for the Aldrin North Section assessment, which she was entitled to do as an adjacent property holder with a shared boundary interest, and the documents arrived in a week, and she reviewed them on a Saturday morning, and she found the discrepancy in the 3rd column of the spring supply ledger, a single entry in the wrong category which had been there for 2 years and had compounded into the flagged discrepancy. She wrote a correction letter to the assessor's office and filed it, and the correction would produce a notice to Ward Aldrin that the discrepancy had been resolved, and the notice would not explain how, and he was going to know, and she was not going to mention it. The second thing was the gate on the shared boundary fence in the north section, which had been stiff since the previous summer. She had used the gate twice in the fall and had noted the stiffness both times, and had said nothing because it was his gate. The stiffness was a hinge problem she could identify from the sound the gate made when she lifted it to swing, which was the sound of a hinge that had lost its alignment and was binding on the pintles. And the fix was a hinge hardware replacement that took 20 minutes. She replaced the hardware in April on a day when she had a legitimate reason to be on that section of the fence line, walking the shared boundary as she did each spring. She had the new hardware in her coat pocket when she left the house. She replaced it and adjusted the swing and tested it 3 times and continued her walk. and she left no note, and she did not mention it. The third thing took longer to address because the third thing required waiting for a specific window. The north section's east pasture had been thin since the previous fall. She had noticed it in October when the grass had come in uneven after the first rain, which was the sign of a pasture that needed reseeding and had not been reseeded at the correct time. And the correct time for reseeding that specific pasture on the north section was the early May window, when the soil temperature and the moisture were both in the narrow range that the Dunmore Range grass seed required to establish correctly. She knew the window because she had been watching it from her side of the boundary for 11 years and had seeded her own adjacent pasture at the same window twice. The window opened on the first Tuesday in May. She had the seed in the barn from the order she had placed in April, which she had placed as a supply order without specifying what it was for, because supply orders did not require explanation. She went to the east pasture at first light and she seeded it correctly, walking the rows with the spreader at the pace that produced the coverage the seed required, and turning at the ends with the care that prevented the edge rows from being thin. And she was finished before midday, and she cleaned the equipment and put it away, and she said nothing. 3 weeks later, the east pasture was showing new growth in the even coverage that meant the seeding had been correct. Ward Aldrin came to her door on a Wednesday in May. He stood on the porch and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had decided something before he came and was going to say it. And she recognized the expression because she had been coming to the same decision in the same way for 2 months, which was deciding to say something that had been accumulating since January and that was ready to be said. He said he had come to say something. She said she was listening. He said he had found the roof in January. She said she knew. He said he had found the south fence in March. She said she knew. He said he had received the county assessor's notice in April. She said she knew. He said he had found the gate hinge in April. She said she knew. He said he had found the east pasture reseeded on Tuesday. She said she knew. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her in the way she had come to know over the 7 months since August, which was the full quality of his attention without any of the social management that most people put over their attention to soften it, and the full quality was something she had been receiving since September and had been understanding better as the months accumulated, which was that it was not intensity for its own sake, but the specific attention of a person who looked at things the way she did, which was completely and without the performance of looking. He said she was not going to mention any of it. She said she had not been planning to. He said he had not been planning to mention the roof or the pantry or the pump or the fence. She said she knew that too. He said they had been doing this since January. She said since November, if you counted the cattle drive, and she had been counting it since March. He was quiet. She said she was going to say something and it was not a thank you. He said he was listening. She said she had been counting since March when she stood at the south fence and counted back to January and then back to November, and the counting had told her something about the person who repaired a roof and filled a pantry and fixed a pump and plumbed a fence and said nothing about any of it. She said she had been in 11 years of a good marriage to a man she had known and respected, and she understood what it looked like when a person did work for someone else because they had decided the work needed doing and the doing was sufficient without the performance of the doing. And she had recognized what she was seeing because she had seen it before, and what she was seeing was a person who understood that the work was the point, and she had been looking for evidence of that specific quality in a neighbor for 7 months and had found it in a repaired roof, he said. She had found it in a repaired roof. She said yes. She said the roof had been the beginning of the evidence, and the east pasture reseeding had been the most recent evidence, and the evidence was sufficient, and she was saying this not as a thank you and not as an accounting of what was owed, but as a statement of what the evidence had told her, he said. What had it told her? She said it had told her that he was a person worth knowing more completely than she had known him in 14 years of adjacent property, and she had decided in April that she was going to tell him so. And she was telling him. He looked at her for a long time in the full quality of his attention. He said he had been watching her manage since August, and she had managed correctly. She said she had managed adequately. She said, correctly? Was what they were working toward. He said they. She said they. He said her name, Faye, said the second time with the full weight of the name of the person who had found the dry ceiling in the full pantry and had said nothing and had then fixed the county assessment and the gate hinge and reseated the east pasture and had stood on the porch in May and said that correctly was what they were working toward. She waited. "I'm not going anywhere." She said it the way she said everything she had decided, which was plainly and as a fact rather than a hope, in the voice of a woman who had been counting evidence since March and had found the count sufficient, and was saying so. She held his gaze. "You repaired the roof and filled the pantry, and fixed the pump and plumbed the fence, and never mentioned any of it. And I answered in the same language, and the language we have been speaking since November is the language I want to keep speaking, and I am not going anywhere." As if it were the simplest arithmetic in the world. Ward Aldrin. Her name for him, said the way a name sounded when it had been the name of the neighbor on the north section for 14 years, and had become the name of the person who understood that the work was the point, and who had been saying so since January in the only language that was worth speaking, which was the language of things done correctly and without announcement. He nodded once. The matter was settled. The roof was repaired and the pantry was stocked and the pump drew correctly and the south fence was plumb and the county assessment was corrected and the gate hinge was sound and the east pasture was showing new growth and the even coverage that meant the seeding had been correct and none of it had been mentioned and all of it had been heard. And Faye Alcott was on the porch in May and she was not going anywhere. They had been speaking the same language since November, and neither of them had named the language until May, and the naming was not necessary for the language to work, but the naming was the thing that made the language permanent, and the permanence was what May was for. The West Dunmore Range was outside, and the May was warm, and the east pasture was coming in green, and the south fence was plumb, and the pump was drawing correctly, and all of these things had been true for weeks and were going to keep being true, and the doing of them was going to continue, and the doing was going to be together now. She had been managing since August with the granular knowledge she was acquiring at the speed of necessity, and the speed of necessity was slower than the speed of two people who each brought their own knowledge to the work. And the slowing had been the cost she had been paying alone, and the alone was ending. And the ending was the porch in May, and the name said the second time with the full weight of it, and the language they had been speaking since November and had just named. Neither of them was going anywhere. The roof was sound and had been sound since January. The pantry had been full since January and would stay full. The pump had been drawing correctly since February. The fence had been plumb since March. The county assessment had been corrected in April. The gate had swung freely since April. The east pasture was coming in green in May and was going to be ready for the summer grazing, and both of them were going to be there for the summer grazing. And the summer was going to be followed by a fall, and the fall was going to be followed by a winter, and neither of them was going anywhere at all. And the West Dunmore Range was going to have all of those seasons, and the work was going to keep being done, and the work was the point, and the point was here, and both of them were staying. She had woken up on a Thursday in January to a dry ceiling and a full pantry, and had understood something that she had not had words for in January, and had found words for in May, and the words were not a thank you, and were not an accounting, and were not a debt recorded and settled. They were a statement of what the evidence had told her. And what the evidence had told her was that the person on the north section had been doing things in the language she had been speaking for 37 years, which was the language of work done correctly and completely and without the performance of completion, and she had been speaking it back since April, and the speaking back was the conversation. And the conversation was still in progress, and it was going to keep being in progress, and neither of them was going anywhere. And the May porch was the beginning of that. And the beginning was here, and both of them were in it. And both of them were staying. He had repaired the roof and filled the pantry and had never mentioned either one. And she had found the chimney flashing he had reset, and the two fence spots she had not identified, and she had not mentioned those either. And the not mentioning was the whole of the language they had been speaking, and the language was still being spoken, and was going to keep being spoken, and the West Dunmore Range was the place where it was going to be spoken, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the work was going to keep being done correctly and without the performance of completion, and both of them understood that, and the thing was here, And it was enough, and both of them were staying. The roof had been leaking since October, and had been repaired in January and had not been mentioned, and the not mentioning had been the beginning of a conversation that had run through February and March and April and into May, and the May was the month the conversation had been named, and the naming was what the May porch was for, and the May porch was where Faye Alcott was standing, and she was not going anywhere, and Ward Aldrin was on the porch with her, and he was not going anywhere either, and the east pasture was coming in green, and the summer was coming, and the work was going to keep being done, and the work was the point, and the point was sound, and it held, and both of them held it.